Fort Yates Prairie, Emmons County, North Dakota, September 1899. The autumn wind carrying the first bitter promises of winter swept across the Dakota plains, flattening the tall grass and biting at the faces of the men gathered near a modest south-facing slope. At the center of this gathering, a man was committing what the local settlement considered an act of architectural madness. Vasyl Kolomiyets was not building a cabin on the prairie. He was systematically carving a massive hole into the side of the hillside terrace. To the established American settlers watching him, the labor appeared incomprehensible. Silas Vance, a man who had survived 3 Dakota winters in a drafty timber frame structure, shook his head in open derision. Elias Thorne, whose own above-ground sod house required constant repairs, openly laughed at the sight of a man moving tons of dirt rather than felling timber. But the loudest and most dangerous criticism came from Harmon Wickersham, the Emmons County land assessor. Wickersham sat atop his horse, a ledger resting against his saddle horn, his eyes narrowed at the excavation. Wickersham did not merely mock the structure, he threatened its very existence. He loudly declared to the gathered men that a cabin partly buried in a hillside was nothing more than a burrow. It was a grave for a living family. More importantly, Wickersham announced that it did not qualify as a dwelling under the strict stipulations of the 1862 Homestead Act. It was foolish, it was primitive, and it was doomed. What did this Bukovinian berm farmer understand about thermal mass and subterranean coupling that the established frontier experts and legal assessors had completely missed? If you want to understand the true mechanics of historical survival, the forgotten engineering of the frontier, and the physics of enduring the most brutal climates on Earth, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. I promise you will learn exactly how Earth-sheltered thermodynamics defeated the killing cold of the American West. Vasyl Kolomiyets was not a timber baron. He was not a prairie sod buster. He was not a New England carpenter trained in the geometry of balloon framing and milled lumber. He was a Zlanka builder from the Bukovina region of Ukraine. His hands knew the weight of dense clay, the moisture of deep loam, the structural arch of root-bound earth, and the specific gravity of packed loess. He understood the physical properties of dirt not as a nuisance to be scraped away, but as the most powerful building material on the planet. In the Old World, specifically around Chernivtsi, the Zlanka, a semi-subterranean dwelling, was a proven method for surviving brutal winters with minimal fuel. Vasyl had brought this deeply ingrained generational knowledge across the Atlantic, arriving in the Dakota Territory with his wife, Oksana, and their 2 children, Ivan and Lesia. They had already endured 1 winter on the open prairie in a temporary, conventional claim shanty, and the memory of that suffering was etched into Vasyl's bones. The cold of the Dakotas was a physical entity, a predator that probed every weakness. The first winter had demonstrated the absolute inadequacy of standard frontier construction. The cold had been so profound that it altered the physical properties of standard materials. A neighbor's steel plowshare had cracked cleanly at the coulter on the very first draw through the frozen topsoil. Inside the local church, the ink had frozen solid in the pastor's baptismal register before the first bell had even finished ringing. In Vasyl's own temporary shanty, a heavy wool cap, left hanging on a wooden peg near the drafty door, had frozen so stiff with condensed ambient moisture that it cracked at the crown when Oksana tried to pull it down. Vasyl observed these failures with the analytical eye of a builder. The standard American prairie cabin was an exercise in thermal defiance, and it was failing. To understand why standard construction failed so completely in the Dakotas, one must examine the physics of the conventional frontier envelope. A typical pioneer cabin was a box sitting on top of the ground, exposing all 4 walls and the roof directly to the elements. This created roughly 1,500 square feet of exterior surface area entirely exposed to the ambient air. The primary mechanism of failure was forced convection driven by the relentless prairie wind. When a 40-mile-per-hour north wind struck a conventional log or board and batten cabin, it stripped the heat from the exterior surfaces at an exponential rate. The timber walls, even when thickly chinked with mud and horsehair, offered an insulating value of perhaps R4. The wind chill effectively drove the exterior temperature down, increasing the temperature differential, the delta T, between the warm interior and the freezing exterior. In a conventional cabin trying to maintain an interior temperature of 65 degrees Celsius, while the outside air was 30 degrees Celsius, the delta T was an immense 95 degrees. Heat moves universally from warm to cold, and it moves faster as the delta T increases. The massive exposed surface area of the conventional cabin meant that heat was bleeding out in all directions simultaneously. To combat this catastrophic heat loss, a settler had to generate massive amounts of energy. A standard cast iron stove in a conventional cabin would consume up to 2 cords of wood a week during a severe cold snap, requiring near constant stoking day and night. The intense heat from the stove would rise immediately to the ceiling, leaving the floor freezing, creating aggressive convection loops inside the cabin that felt like cold drafts even when the doors were sealed tight. Neighbors like Silas Vance and Elias Thorne spent their winters trapped in a desperate, exhausting cycle of gathering fuel, chopping wood, and feeding fires just to keep the interior temperature slightly above freezing. Vasyl Kolomiyets looked at the flat, wind-scoured prairie and rejected the American box. He selected a specific site on his claim, a natural terrace facing directly south. Here, he began to build his Bukovinian Zlanka. The physical labor was staggering, and he executed it with mathematical precision. He laid out a footprint measuring exactly 16 by 22 feet. Instead of building up, he dug down. He excavated the interior floor 3 feet below the natural grade of the terrace, moving cubic yard after cubic yard of heavy Dakota loess. Loess is a wind-blown silt, highly cohesive, capable of holding a vertical face without slumping, and incredibly dense. Once the foundation pit was established, Vasyl constructed the structural envelope. He felled local cottonwood and oak, shaping a stout, interlocking log skin to form the interior walls. But these logs were not the primary defense against the winter. They were merely the retaining structure for the true thermal barrier. Once the log walls were raised, Vasyl initiated the most critical phase of the construction. He hauled the excavated loess and packed it meticulously against the exterior of the north, east, and west walls. He built this earth berm 4 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as it rose to the eaves. He tamped the dirt endlessly, compacting it to remove air pockets, bonding the structure directly to the hillside. For the roof, he laid heavy timber rafters, spanned them with tightly fitted poles, covered them with a layer of brush and prairie hay, and finally capped the entire structure with a continuous 12-inch layer of thick, root-bound sod. This roof was not a separate entity. It was graded to merge seamlessly with the earth berms and the hillside behind it. When the construction was complete, the cabin was virtually invisible from the north. The north, east, and west walls were entirely swallowed by the earth. Only the south wall, measuring roughly 150 square feet and featuring a heavy door and a deeply recessed, double-paned glass window, was exposed to the open air. It was during this final phase of construction that Harmon Wickersham returned to officially assess the property. Wickersham was a man of the bureaucracy, a staunch believer in the civilized aesthetic of the East. He looked at the massive mound of dirt, the single exposed south wall, and the sod roof blending into the prairie grass. "This is not a house, Kolomiyets," Wickersham declared, his voice carrying the sharp edge of official authority. "The Homestead Act requires a habitable dwelling, a structure built upon the land, representing agricultural improvement. You have dug a cellar. You have built a burrow for an animal. Vasyl stood near the heavy south door, a wooden spade in his calloused hands. He looked at the assessor, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the sturdy log framing visible around the door. "It is a house," Vasyl said quietly. "It will keep my family alive." Wickersham scoffed, pulling a fountain pen from his coat to make a sharp, dark notation in his ledger. "I am telling the land office in Bismarck that this is a subterranean storage pit, not a dwelling. If you do not build a proper, freestanding cabin by April, I will see your title revoked. You will lose this land. You are wasting your time on a grave." The economic threat was absolute. If Wickersham rejected the structure, the Kolomiyets family would lose their 160-acre claim, their labor, and their future in America. The mockery of the community was one thing. The bureaucratic execution of their livelihood was another. Yet Vasyl did not panic. He did not attempt to hastily erect a flimsy wooden box to satisfy the assessor's visual preferences. He simply turned back to the south wall, packed the final layer of mud chinking around the doorframe, and prepared for winter. To understand why Vasyl was so quietly confident, and why Wickersham was so fundamentally wrong, one must delve into the specific physics of Earth-sheltered thermodynamics and thermal mass. The secret of the Zlanka was not merely insulation, it was thermal coupling to the Earth's deep reservoir. Below the frost line, the Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, reflecting the average annual temperature of the region. In the Dakota territory, this deep Earth temperature hovers around 48 degrees. By sinking his cabin 3 feet into the ground and berming the north, east, and west walls with 4 feet of compacted loess, Vasyl had fundamentally altered the microclimate of his dwelling. Consider the surface area and the delta T. A conventional cabin had 1,500 square feet exposed to 38-degree air. Vasyl's cabin had only 150 square feet, the south wall, exposed to the ambient air. The other 350 square feet of his exterior envelope were directly coupled to the massive thermal inertia of the Earth. When the outside air temperature plummeted to 38-degree Fahrenheit, the Earth surrounding Vasyl's north, east, and west walls did not drop to 38-degree Fahrenheit. The massive density of the 4-foot loess berms and the hillside itself acted as a thermal battery. The cold had to physically penetrate feet of dense soil before it could reach the log skin. Because soil has a high specific heat capacity, roughly 0.2 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit, it takes an immense amount of energy, or lack thereof, to change its temperature. The dirt was essentially holding a steady temperature of around 45 degrees Celsius to 48 degrees Celsius against the exterior of the logs. Therefore, Vasyl was not trying to heat a box surrounded by 38 degrees for air. He was heating a box mostly surrounded by 48 degrees for dirt. If Vasyl wanted to maintain a comfortable interior temperature of 78 degrees, the delta T across his buried walls was only 30 degrees, 78 minus 48. The only place he faced the massive 116-degree delta T, 78 minus 38, was across the small 150-square-foot south wall. The heat loss calculations were staggering in their disparity. A conventional cabin in those conditions would bleed approximately 25,000 to 30,000 BTUs per hour, requiring a massive roaring fire. Vasyl's earth-sheltered Zlanka, protected by tons of thermal mass and shielded entirely from the forced convection of the north wind, lost only about 4,000 BTUs per hour. Furthermore, the south-facing orientation was not accidental. It was an application of passive solar engineering. During the winter, the sun sits low in the southern sky. The recessed south window allowed the low-angle winter sunlight to penetrate deep into the cabin, striking the heavy earthen floor and the dense log walls, directly charging the interior thermal mass, with free solar radiation. Because the heat loss was so minimal, Vasyl's heating requirements were drastically reduced. He installed a standard cast-iron potbelly stove, but he did not need to run it at a roaring draft. The stove required only 1/6 of the firewood compared to his neighbors. A few thick splits of oak in the morning, allowed to burn down to a slow, smoldering bed of coals, were entirely sufficient to maintain a steady, deeply comfortable 78 throughout the day and night. The true crucible arrived in late January. A massive polar outbreak descended upon the Dakota plains, a meteorological event that would be recorded in regional histories for decades. For 13 consecutive nights, the ambient air temperature sustained a brutal 38°. Worse, a 40-mile-per-hour north wind screamed across the flat prairie, stripping the protective snow cover away and exposing the frozen ground directly to the killing air. The conditions were apocalyptic. The wind chill pushed the effective temperature to a level where human flesh would freeze in minutes. Inside the conventional cabins of the settlement, the suffering was profound. Silas Vance spent 3 sleepless days and nights huddled next to his stove, watching in despair as 3 of his prized calves froze, standing up in a poorly sealed outbuilding. Elias Thorne, having exhausted his cordwood, resorted to breaking apart his own wooden furniture and feeding it into the firebox just to keep his family from slipping into hypothermia. The cold was so intense that the kerosene in the settlers' lamps began to gel, the flames shrinking and turning a strange, oxygen-starved blue. The wind hammered against the timber walls, finding every microscopic gap in the chinking, driving invisible blades of freezing air into the living spaces. The Kolomiyets family experienced none of this. While the prairie above them screamed in a whiteout of blowing ice, the interior of the hillside cabin was profoundly quiet. The 4 feet of dense loess completely absorbed the acoustic violence of the 40-mile-per-hour wind. Inside, the air was still, warm, and heavy with the smell of wood smoke and drying herbs. The potbelly stove radiated a gentle, consistent heat. Because the walls themselves were warm, insulated by the earth, there were no aggressive convection loops, no cold drafts sweeping across the floor. It was during the absolute lowest point of this polar outbreak on the afternoon of January 13th that Harmon Wickersham found himself caught in the open. He was driving the tax circuit, attempting to return to Fort Yates before the sun set and the temperature dropped even further. He was wrapped in heavy buffalo robes, his face masked against the wind, but the cold was penetrating his defenses. Disaster struck just as he was passing the Kolomiyets' claim. The iron runner of his heavy horse-drawn sled, brittle from the extreme negative temperatures, struck a frozen rut and snapped cleanly in half. Wickersham was stranded. The wind was howling, the temperature was dropping past 30°, and Fort Yates was miles away. He looked toward the hillside. The earth-sheltered cabin was barely visible, just a white mound against the slope. But a thin, steady plume of gray smoke rose from the stone chimney. Driven by absolute necessity, Wickersham abandoned his ruined sled, tied his struggling horse in the lee of the hillside, and waded through the drifts toward the south wall. He fully expected to find a dark, freezing mud hole. He expected to find the Kolomiyets family huddled in misery, smelling of rot and desperation, suffering exactly as his legal assessment had predicted. He reached the heavy timber door, knocked frantically with a frozen, mittened fist, and pushed his way inside. Wickersham ducked through the south door, intending to ask to use the newly strung rural party line telephone that Vasyl had recently bartered for, or at the very least, to warm his freezing hands before attempting to repair his sled. He stepped over the threshold, pushed the door shut against the howling wind, and stopped entirely. The sensory contrast was so violent it momentarily confused him. Wickersham expected the sharp ache of frost-heaved floorboards and the sight of frozen breath hanging in the air. He expected the desperate, huddled survival posture he had seen in every other cabin on his route. Instead, the air that hit his face was not just warm, it was deeply, structurally hot. It was a heavy, dry, enveloping 78 degrees. Within 30 seconds of standing in the entryway, the massive thermal contrast caused Wickersham to begin sweating. His hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled as he rapidly unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat. He looked into the main living space. The numerical contrast of the temperature was undeniable, but the image contrast was what shattered Wickersham's preconceptions. Vasyl's children, Ivan and Lesia, were not huddled near the stove in heavy coats. They were playing on the dry, hard-packed earthen floor, wearing light linen shirt sleeves, entirely barefoot. Oksana sat near the recessed south window, utilizing the natural light to mend a garment. Her posture relaxed, unburdened by the tension of the cold. Vasyl sat near the stove, not frantically feeding it, but calmly whittling a piece of oak. The final, undeniable proof of the cabin's thermal triumph rested on a simple wooden shelf built into the eastern log wall. It was January 13th, the day of Zlanka, the traditional Ukrainian New Year's Eve. On the shelf sat a large ceramic crock filled with holubtsi, cabbage rolls stuffed with meat and rice, submerged in a rich tomato sauce. In Silas Vance's cabin, a pot of water placed 3 feet from the stove had frozen solid overnight. In Elias Thorne's home, food had to be thawed with an axe. But here, in the Zlanka, the crock of holubtsi rested on a shelf 10 feet away from the pot-belly stove. Wickersham, staring in disbelief, reached out and touched the side of the ceramic crock with his bare palm. It was warm. It was soft. The ambient heat of the earth-sheltered room was so consistent, so evenly distributed, that the cabbage rolls had remained warm and soft throughout the entirety of the brutal polar outbreak, simply sitting on a shelf. Wickersham stood in the center of the room, his heavy coat pooled around his boots, the sweat drying on his forehead. The reality of the physics had completely dismantled the arrogance of the bureaucracy. He looked at the thick log walls, realizing they were merely the inner lining of a much larger geological structure. The earth itself was holding the cold at bay. He turned to Vasyl, his voice stripped of all its previous official authority. "You didn't build a cabin," Wickersham said quietly. "You built a thermal anchor." Vasyl looked up from his whittling, his expression unchanged. He did not gloat. He did not demand an apology for the threats of April eviction. He simply gestured to a wooden chair near the stove. "Sit," Vasyl said. "The cold is bad today. Eat some cabbage." Wickersham did not revoke the title in April. Instead, he became an unintentional evangelist for the Bukovinian method. The assessor, whose job was to mandate standard American improvements, spent the spring telling every freezing, desperate settler in Emmons County about the hillside that held back the winter. The validation spread quickly. The frontier did not care about architectural pedigree, it cared about survival. By March of 1900, the Ukrainsky Dnevnik, a Ukrainian-language newspaper operating out of Bismarck, printed a detailed schematic of Kolomiyets' hillside berm design. The article detailed the precise measurements, the depth of the excavation, the thickness of the lowest berms, and the critical southern exposure. The numbers were impossible to ignore. While conventional cabins were burning through 8 cords of wood a winter, Vasyl had burned slightly more than 1. By the autumn of 1900, 6 Bukovinian families across Emmons and Logan counties had abandoned their freestanding shanties and carved their own zemlyankas into the south-facing terraces of the Dakotas. They adopted the hillside berms, the thick sod roofs, and the recessed southern windows. The fuel savings across these 6 families averaged a staggering 83%. The engineering principles that Vasyl Kolomiyets employed in 1899 were not primitive. They were centuries ahead of the American building curve. What the frontier assessors dismissed as a burrow, modern building science now recognizes as high-performance, earth-sheltered design. The concepts of massive thermal coupling, passive solar orientation, and the utilization of the Earth's constant subterranean temperature did not gain widespread modern traction until the energy crises of the 1970s. Today, architects utilize concrete, rigid foam insulation, and advanced glazing to achieve what Vasyl accomplished with a wooden spade, local oak, and tons of packed loess. The modern earth-bermed home operates on the exact same thermodynamic reality. The Earth is an infinite thermal battery, and when a structure is properly coupled to it, the violent fluctuations of the surface weather become irrelevant. The story of the Emmons County Zlanka is a testament to the superiority of adapted, generational knowledge over rigid, institutional groupthink. The established experts of the frontier believed that civilization meant building a wooden box on top of the ground and fighting the sky with fire. They measured progress by how fiercely they could combat the environment. Vasyl Kolomiyets succeeded because he refused to fight the environment on its own terms. He didn't build a cabin against the prairie winter. He asked a hillside to be 3 walls and left only the sunny one for the sky. If you found this exploration of historical earth-sheltered engineering fascinating, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced the profound thermal stability of an earth-bermed structure or a root cellar during extreme weather? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and events are fictional. Techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. Modern application should follow current standards, safety guidelines, and regulations. This does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.